Marcus Thorne was the kind of neighbor every community dreams of having, but few truly deserve. At 38, he carried himself with a quiet, disciplined grace that was the direct result of 15 years serving as a Navy SEAL. He moved through the world with a deliberate calmness, a man who had seen the worst of humanity in distant lands and decided, upon returning home, to be the best of it. When he purchased his home in the pristine, gate-guarded community of Silver Oaks, he wasn't looking for status. He was looking for peace. He wanted a place where his 7-year-old daughter Maya could ride her bike without a care in the world, and where the only missions he had to worry about were Saturday morning pancake breakfasts and keeping his lawn neatly trimmed. But Silver Oaks was governed by a homeowners association that viewed peace not as a state of mind, but as a rigid set of aesthetic rules enforced with a heavy hand. At the center of this enforcement was the HOA president, Richard Miller. Richard was a retired police officer who had traded his badge for a clipboard, but in his mind, he was still patrolling a beat. He walked the streets of the neighborhood with a proprietary air, eyeing every mailbox and blade of grass for the slightest infraction. To Richard, Marcus Thorne was an anomaly he couldn't quite process. He saw a tall, muscular black man who drove a high-end truck and lived in a house that was always perfectly maintained, yet Marcus didn't fit into Richard's narrow vision of what a Silver Oaks resident should look like. The tension began subtly. It started with minor citations: a trash can left out 2 hours past the pickup window, a disorderly flower bed that was actually just a few native wildflowers Marcus had planted to attract butterflies for Maya. Marcus handled these with his signature stoicism. He would smile, nod, and rectify the issue immediately. He didn't want trouble. He had spent enough of his life in conflict. However, Richard Miller didn't want compliance. He wanted a reason to assert dominance. He began spending more time parked near Marcus's driveway, watching. He would claim he was monitoring traffic safety, but everyone in the neighborhood knew who he was really watching. The atmosphere in Silver Oaks began to shift. Neighbors who once waved at Marcus started to avert their eyes, feeling the silent pressure from Richard's scrutiny. It was a classic HOA power play, but it was tinged with something much darker, a deep-seated prejudice that Richard didn't even try to hide when he spoke to his inner circle of board members. He referred to Marcus as that element, and whispered about how the neighborhood's character was changing. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Saturday afternoon during the annual Silver Oaks block party. It was the one day of the year when the gates were metaphorically thrown open, and the entire community gathered in the central cul-de-sac for a barbecue. Marcus was at the grill, having been asked by several friendly neighbors to handle the ribs, a task he took on with tactical precision. Maya was nearby, playing tag with a group of children. The air was filled with the smell of charcoal and the sound of laughter. It felt, for a brief moment, like the community Marcus had envisioned. That was until Richard Miller arrived, wearing his old department polo shirt and a scowl that could wilt a rosebush. He didn't come to eat, he came to inspect. He walked straight over to Marcus, ignoring the greetings of others. He told Marcus that the grill was a fire hazard and that he hadn't cleared the commercial-grade cooking equipment with the board. Marcus, flipping a rack of ribs, calmly explained that it was a standard consumer-grade smoker and that he had checked the bylaws weeks ago. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. He wasn't used to being corrected, especially not by someone he considered an interloper. The confrontation escalated quickly. Richard began shouting, his voice echoing off the surrounding houses. He accused Marcus of being aggressive and threatening, despite Marcus standing perfectly still with his hands visible. The crowd of neighbors began to gather, sensing the shift in energy. Richard, feeling the eyes of the community on him, decided to play his ultimate card. He pulled out his phone and called the local police department, claiming there was a domestic disturbance with a potentially armed individual at the block party. The silence that fell over the cul-de-sac was chilling. Marcus didn't move. He looked at Richard with a mix of pity and disappointment. He knew exactly what Richard was doing. He knew the danger of the words Richard was using. Within minutes, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt at the edge of the party. Out stepped Officer Miller Jr., Richard's son, and his partner. Richard pointed a shaking finger at Marcus, shouting that he was out of control. Officer Miller, fueled by his father's biased narrative, didn't ask questions. He didn't look at the confused faces of the neighbors or the crying children. He saw a large black man and a supposed threat. He ordered Marcus to the ground. Marcus, understanding the volatility of the situation, complied instantly. He knelt, then lay flat on the hot asphalt, his face pressed against the stones. He kept his voice low and steady, identifying himself as a veteran and stating he was unarmed. But the younger Miller was looking for a performance for his father. He moved in with unnecessary force, slamming his knee into Marcus's back and wrenching his arms behind him. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was deafening in the silence. But Richard and his son had made a critical mistake. They had forgotten the world we live in now. As Marcus was being pressed into the ground, dozens of neighbors had pulled out their phones. They weren't just watching, they were recording. A young woman named Sarah, who lived 2 doors down from Marcus and had always admired his kindness, stepped forward. She wasn't just recording, she was narrating loudly and clearly exactly what had happened. She detailed Richard's unprovoked shouting, Marcus's calm demeanor, and the false report Richard had made on the phone. Other neighbors joined in, forming a literal circle around Marcus and the officers. They began shouting the truth, he did nothing wrong.
Richard lied.
We have it all on video. The younger Miller looked up, suddenly realizing that he wasn't in a vacuum. He saw 50 cameras pointed at him, 50 witnesses who weren't going to let this narrative be rewritten. The tension was palpable. The partner, a more experienced officer, looked at the crowd and then at the sweating, panicked Richard Miller. He realized the situation was a disaster. He stepped in, telling his partner to stand down. He helped Marcus up, though the handcuffs remained on for a moment longer as they tried to sort through the chaos. At that exact moment, a black SUV pulled into the cul-de-sac. Out stepped Commander Sterling, a high-ranking official from the nearby naval base and a personal friend of Marcus's. He had been invited to the barbecue and arrived just in time to see his former teammate being treated like a criminal. The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. When Sterling showed his credentials and identified Marcus not just as a resident, but as a decorated Navy SEAL with a record of service that put Richard's glory days to shame, the air seemed to leave Richard's lungs. The crowd didn't stop. They showed the officers the footage, the clear, undeniable evidence of Richard's verbal assault and the peaceful way Marcus had responded. They showed the footage of Richard's son using excessive force on a man who was already complying. The senior officer's face went pale. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. This was a documented civil rights violation and a false police report. Under the immense pressure of the crowd and the presence of a military commander, the handcuffs were removed. Marcus stood up, brushing the dust from his clothes.
He didn't yell. He didn't retaliate.
He walked over to Maya, who was being held by a kind neighbor, and hugged her tightly, shielding her eyes from the remaining chaos. The aftermath was swift and devastating for the Millers. The video went viral that evening, garnering millions of views within 24 hours. The local news picked it up, and the headline "Decorated SEAL Targeted by HUA President" became a national story. The police department placed the younger Miller on administrative leave pending a full investigation into his conduct and the potential conspiracy with his father. But the real change happened within Silver Oaks. The neighbors, galvanized by the shame of what they had almost allowed to happen, called an emergency meeting the following night. Richard Miller was not just removed from the board, he was essentially cast out of the social fabric of the community. The silent majority that had allowed his bullying to continue for years finally found their voice. Weeks later, the neighborhood looked different. The gates were still there, but the atmosphere had transformed. Marcus remained in his home, despite the trauma of that day. He decided that he wouldn't be driven out of the peace he had earned. He was eventually elected as the new HOA president, not because he wanted the power, but because the neighbors begged him to lead them toward a more inclusive and kind future. The butterfly garden that Richard had tried to cite was expanded into a community park. The story of what happened to Marcus Thorne became a legend in the town. A reminder that power, when fueled by prejudice, is a fragile thing that can be shattered by the simple act of people standing together and recording the truth. Marcus often sits on his porch in the evenings now, watching the kids play. He knows that true security doesn't come from walls or rules, but from the strength of a community that refuses to look away when an injustice is committed in their name. The scars on his wrists from the handcuffs faded, but the bond he formed with his neighbors that day became permanent. He had survived many battles in his life, but winning the heart of his own neighborhood was perhaps his greatest victory. The moral of the story resonated far beyond the gates of Silver Oaks. It served as a powerful testament to the fact that integrity is a shield that eventually reflects the truth, no matter how much someone tries to bury it. Richard Miller, once the self-appointed king of the cul-de-sac, eventually sold his house and moved away, unable to face the people who had seen his true nature. In his place, a community grew that valued character over compliance and neighbors over rules. Marcus Thorne continued to live his life with the same quiet dignity he always had, a man who had faced the fire and come out not just unburned, but stronger, proving that even in the face of deep-seated bias, the light of collective courage can capture everything that matters.